As Russia continues their advance into Kharkiv, there are more and more reports coming out that Russian forces are deliberately targeting Ukrainian civilians. And as we see more pictures emerge showing the aftermath of some of these events, there's increasing concerns that Volchansk could be the next Bucha. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about civilians being caught in the middle of the war zone, some sort of collateral damage, which is a tragic reality in war. Sometimes civilians try to evacuate an area, they're caught between two forces engaged in an active fight, and some are accidentally shot. In other cases, artillery rounds or bombs fall off target or on target, and there happen to be civilians nearby. In this case, the reports coming out from Volchansk are that civilians are being deliberately and systematically targeted by Russian forces. Now, when you hear arguments, generally in the West, about Ukraine laying down their arms or surrendering, seeking some sort of peace with Russia, this event right here, this series of events, is a prime example as to why that's not in the cards for so many Ukrainians. There's a very real concern, a very rational concern based off of recent historic events, that if the Ukrainian armed forces were to lay down their arms, cede some of this territory to Russia, they would see a continuation, if not an increase, in the targeting and killing of their fellow citizens, the innocent civilians of Ukraine. Now I want to shift over to a map to give you an idea of the area we're going to be talking about today. The Kharkiv offensive is taking part in this northeastern portion of the country here. We'll zoom in a little bit, and this is looking at Suryak map, which tends to be a little more optimistic on the Russian side, if you will. So they're reporting more Russian gains faster all along the front. The area we're going to be looking at, there's two main areas where Russia has pushed forces into what they're referring to now as a buffer zone. The area we're going to be talking about today is one of the more easternmost towns here, Volchansk. So looking at reports from Russian mill blogger 2 Majors to give you an idea of what's happening here. He says the creation of the buffer zone in Kharkov region continues. As a quick note, Russia generally refers to this area as Kharkov. Ukraine refers to it as Kharkiv. It's the same area, same region, just pronounced 2 different ways. 2 Major says, our troops are advancing in the direction with heavy fighting. Lipsy and Volchansk, they're constantly being hit by heavy weapons, and more footage of Ukrainian prisoners is appearing. Again, a lot of the fighting and a lot of the speculation on both sides about the progress is happening in and around Vovchansk here, because you see there is a significant civilian population that lived there and still lives there. In fact, there are reports right now that as many as 200 Ukrainian civilians are trapped now behind this front line of contact in what is now Russian-held territory. Now, when I said earlier that there's concerns that Volchansk here could turn into the next Bucha, I'm referring to an event that happened at the very start of the war, commonly referred to now as the Bucha massacre. In that event, 458 bodies, Ukrainian bodies, were recovered from the town, according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. They documented quite a few summary executions, at least 73 civilians included in that mix, and civilians, some soldiers or had been fighting and then were executed after their capture. There were a lot of photos and videos that emerged from this showing the corpses of civilians lined up with their hands bound behind their backs, shot at close range. An inquiry by Radio Free Europe reported the use of a basement underneath a camp, a headquarters building, being used as a Russian torture chamber. There were quite a few bodies identified later having been mutilated and burnt, girls as young as 14 reporting to have been raped by Russian soldiers. In some intercepted conversations, Russian soldiers referred to these operations, talking about this openly in Bucha, as filtration, torture, and talked about it as a sort of cleansing. Right? Tragic events all around. Ukraine, in fact, has asked the International Criminal Court to investigate what happened in Bucha as part of an ongoing investigation into Russian war crimes committed in Ukraine. So anything that even starts to hint at that happening again, of course, is going to be on the radar, and that's why I thought this was worth bringing up today. Now, getting into the specific events in Volchansk that are raising this alarm, starting with Ukrainian photographer Konstantin Liberov, who is in Volchansk right now. Again, remember, only a portion of that town is under Russian control. There is still a significant portion under Ukrainian control with quite a few civilians there. He said, quote, the photos show the bodies of 2 civilian women. Next to them are 2 small specific craters. For those who understand, it is immediately clear that this is not a random mine or artillery strike. With a 90% probability, these are targeted drops from a drone. The women are wearing bright clothing. It is impossible to mistake them for military personnel, even from a height. He says the city is filled with death. Civilian bodies are on the streets and under the rubble. Despite this, volunteers and police continue under shelling while risking their lives to evacuate those who can still be saved. Now, there are a series of photos coming out showing what appear to be civilians killed in bright colored clothing. It's very hard, as he mentions here, to mistake some of these folks for military personnel. I'll link a thread to those in the description below. Just a personal choice. I prefer to not show the deceased pictures of dead bodies on this channel, but they're circulating far and wide across Telegram and Twitter. Not hard to find, but again, there will be a link in the description if you want to seek those out. And again, I would imagine we're going to see a lot more coming out here in the near future. Then last week, there was a picture circulating showing an elderly Ukrainian woman who apparently had been shot and killed by Russian forces while in a wheelchair south of Volchansk. We have more information on that now because her husband, 70-year-old husband, who was traveling with her, trying to evacuate together, made his way to Ukrainian lines and was able to retell his story. According to the series of events that he relayed to the Kharkiv Regional Prosecutor's Office, this man, 70 years old, and his wife decided it was time to get out of Volchansk, evacuate the area before the Russians got there. He got his wife a wheelchair because she'd been having problems with her legs. They teamed up with one other civilian and began movement south. When they neared the hospital, the local hospital, Russian forces opened fire. Now, this is an elderly man, 70, along with his wife in a wheelchair, wearing bright colors, and one other man with him. In no way, shape, or form is that going to look like military personnel, uniformed military personnel. The Russian forces opened fire, killed the young man as well as the woman in the wheelchair. The 70-year-old man, the husband, continued movement south, tried to get out of there. Eventually, the wheelchair wheels got bound up as they were going off-road. He was forced to leave his dead wife, and that is where the picture came from. He did eventually link up with Ukrainian forces and made his way to Kharkiv safely. Now, we're starting to see more and more of these pictures that show Ukrainian civilians dead in the street, very similar to what we saw in Bucha, and it's likely that the number of these pictures and videos are going to increase because we have as many as 200 Ukrainian civilians still trapped behind Russian lines that are likely going to try to evacuate any way possible. Now, in terms of what this means, I can understand how this might seem relatively small in scale compared with the tens or even hundreds of thousands of casualties that have so far been sustained in this war. But I think it's worth highlighting for a couple of reasons. First, if this is anywhere headed in the direction of Bucha, of course, the international community needs to be paying attention to make sure this type of atrocity does not happen or continue. Now, it is very early. We're just seeing the initial reports, so we'll wait for more to come out. The other side of this is just to help understand why so many in Ukraine have no desire to negotiate with Russia, right? This isn't a matter of giving Russia a few kilometers of terrain here or there. These are innocent Ukrainian civilians, women, children, and the elderly being deliberately targeted by Russian forces and killed simply for being Ukrainian, right? So think about this when conversations come up about negotiations, about letting Russia keep the land that they've already taken in the east and portions of the north. I mean, we just in a recent video here talked about the countless Russian advantages that they have over Ukraine on this battlefield. And it's understandable how when you look at that and faced with that sort of uphill struggle, that, you know, Ukraine laying down their arms and surrendering territory to stop the war could be a viable option to, you know, prevent the further loss of life. But put yourself in their shoes, in the shoes of a Ukrainian soldier, a service member, a politician, a leader inside of the country. If you watched your own civilians, innocent women and children being killed by an invading Russian army, would you call it quits? Or would you fight back with everything you've got? But that's all I got for now. Again, developing situation. We'll try to keep an eye on this, and hopefully it does not turn out anywhere near what we saw in Bucha a few years ago. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.